Namaskar and thank you for joining us on our continued coverage of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Vienna, Austria. This is his first visit to the land of Mozart and Beethoven. The Prime Minister will be addressing the Indian community in a short while from now, and it is a much anticipated event, and it's going to be taking place at the Sophie Ansal Hall. It's in fact an iconic historical hall that was actually burnt down and rebuilt, and it was where, great musicians of the past had performed live. Now, Austria is a country which is rich in cultural history, much like India, and Indian music and dance, literature and art have also found resonance in Austria, as our correspondents have been giving us reports. Now, we'll talk about the diplomatic and other highlights of Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit, and we'll also bring you his address live in a short while. But India and Austria now have elevated their cooperation, their ties, to a strategic level, signaling new possibilities in several dynamic fields. The Indian Prime Minister and the Austrian Chancellor, they held talks in Vienna, and the Indian leader reiterated that this is not the time for war.
A friendship cast in stone, a bond which has weathered the test of time. And now India-Austria relationship has been elevated to a higher level with India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to the Central European nation. In a historic visit, the first by an Indian Prime Minister to Austria in 41 years, both countries have agreed to elevate their ties to a strategic one with a 10-year roadmap. Prime Minister Modi and Austrian Chancellor held talks over several critical global issues.
हमने निर्णय लिया है कि संबंधों को स्ट्रेटेजिक दिशा प्रदान की जाएगी। इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर विकास, इनोवेशन, रिन्यूएबल एनर्जी, हाइड्रोजन, वाटर एंड वेस्ट मैनेजमेंट, आर्टिफिशियल इंटेलिजेंस, क्वांटम जैसे क्षेत्रों में एक दूसरे के सामर्थ्य को जोड़ने का काम किया जाएगा।
The two leaders discussed the Ukraine and West Asia conflicts and reiterated the need to establish peace through progressive talks.
मैंने पहले भी कहा है कि यह युद्ध का समय नहीं है। समस्याओं का समाधान रणभूमि में नहीं हो सकता। कहीं भी हो, मासूम लोगों की जान की हानि स्वीकार्य नहीं है।
India is the biggest democracy in the world, and therefore India's role, especially for Austria, is more than important when it comes to the peace process and future peace summits.
Prime Minister Modi also met Austrian President Alexander van der Bellen in Vienna. Both leaders held talks and discussed several issues of mutual and global interests. To further strengthen economic ties, Prime Minister Modi and Austrian Chancellor jointly addressed renowned Austrian and Indian CEOs at Roundtable Business Meeting in Hofburg Palace. Prime Minister highlighted significant potential for collaboration between Indian and Austrian companies in new and emerging technologies. Prime Minister also invited Austrian companies to invest in India. Earlier in the day, Prime Minister Modi was accorded a ceremonial reception at the Federal Chancellery in Vienna, Austria. PM comes at a time when both nations are marking 75 years of their friendship.
After this visit to Vienna, the relationship is supposed to get a quantum jump, and that is what these two leaders have talked about, and they've also offered to act as bridges of peace in wherever the world is in conflict, because that's something that the world doesn't need. It needs to move forward towards progress in a sustainable manner. This is Gautam Roy in Vienna, Austria for DD India.
And we have with us in the studio Ambassador Deepak Vora. Ambassador Deepak Vora is a former senior diplomat who's also served in Vienna. And Dr. Swasti Rao is Associate Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis, who's joining us via video link. Thank you very much, both of you, for being with us. Ambassador Vora, so let's put into context the issue of Russia, which came up, and we also showed that in our story here. Prime Minister saying, as he did in Samarkand, that this is not the time for war. He also talked about a solution not being found on the battlefield, and he mentioned about, the great sorrow when children are, killed in conflict. How do you view, India's role? He also said that, if there is got to be a solution, it's got to be through dialogue and diplomacy, and India is willing to do whatever it takes.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Lin. Always a pleasure to come home to my mother. Her name is Doordarshan.
Yes.
You are here and Ms. Rao is there and you don't need me. She's brilliant. She's outstanding. Prime Minister has constantly been talking about peace and saying that there is a solution, but that solution will be found through dialogue and diplomacy. Let me put it to you in a different way. Who wants peace in Ukraine? I don't think the West does. I don't think the Americans do. Their policy is dadagiri. Our policy is dosti. We want it there. There's an expression, there's a proverb in Africa, when the elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. The grass in this case is Ukraine, which is being practically obliterated by the belligerents. Ukraine supplied with NATO weaponry and so on, and NATO advisors, and Russia fighting, as we know, it is fighting. So Prime Minister repeating this constantly is a message to both sides that if you are willing to sit down and talk, a solution can be found. People have talked about whether India can play some kind of a mediatory role. That is romantic nonsense. We will not mediate. We don't do this kind of thing. And why should we? At the moment, there's a hardening of attitudes. The gentleman in Kiev says that I'm ready for peace provided Putin falls at my feet and begs me to forgive him and goes and faces trial in the International Criminal Court. All kinds of unreasonable demands. On the other hand, Shri Vladimir Putin has his own requirements that NATO is a niet, no, right, for Ukraine, etc. So there's no meeting ground at the moment. When it comes, India will certainly use its good offices, maybe give them a room to sit down, serve them some tea and say, talk to each other, guys, but mediation is out of the question. So I see this as a reiteration of our policy, not just in the present conflict, but also in conflicts around the world. Solve the issue. When we diplomats fail, we give it to the military to sort it out. When they have sorted it out, we diplomats come back and sign the agreement.
Dr. Rao, what are your comments on this? Because the Foreign Secretary at the press briefing was pressed, by the foreign press to give an answer about what India really can do in this situation. And of course, he did repeat what the Prime Minister said. He did talk about India being in a position to do whatever it takes to bring the two parties together for dialogue. How do you view this?
A very good evening to you, Mark, there, and good evening to Ambassador Bohra, and thank you for those kind words. It's always a pleasure to share a discussion with him, and you don't know how time flies when he's speaking. Anyway, so with respect to your question more directly about what role can India play, partly one has to understand that there's only limited role that India can play, because frankly, no one can bring the war to an end except for the players that Ambassador Bohra also mentioned. So I think there's little doubt on that. But with respect to what role can then India play, I think there's also a bit of fine tuning that one needs to do if you want to understand what role has India been playing in this particular war, and particularly around the peace mediation efforts. So, for example, I keep getting this question a lot about India not signing the joint communique at the Swiss summit, but of course, there's a reason to that, and I'll tell you in a while what reason that is. But the fact is that it is often overlooked that India has consistently been a part of all the 4 major multilateral collaborative peace summits, starting from Copenhagen in Denmark. Then from there to Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. By the way, I consider Jeddah's peace summit to be the most successful till date. The third one happened in Malta, and the fourth one was the one that happened in Switzerland. Now, the Switzerland one was different from the other 3 because it came up with a joint communique. The other 3 did not come with a joint communique. And India refused to sign on the joint communique because obviously there can be no real peace if you don't talk to Russia. That's number one. But right, in a more technical manner, India did not sign on it, because that joint communique was derived from 2 of United Nations General Assembly resolutions where India had abstained as well. So it made perfect sense for India to keep the technical consistency in place. Now, despite that, let me get back to the Jeddah summit. The Jeddah summit happened in Saudi Arabia. So, from our side, it was attended by the National Security Advisor, Shri Ajit Doval. And if you go into the details of what the Jeddah summit actually came up with, it came up with certain working groups. And now I'm building a case for what really those that are interested in some sort of mediation can do. They actually put in place certain working groups with an objective of partial mediation. When I say partial mediation, I'm absolutely drawing a contrast from total mediation, because total mediation right now is not possible. It is not possible to bring the war to an end, also considering the kind of an escalation and the kind of military preparedness that exists on both sides. But limited mediation or partial mediation is something which is very much possible. And by that, I mean, for example, understanding on prisoners of war, exchange of prisoners of war, not targeting the civilian targets, etc., food, fuel, fertilizer, the securing those kind of, supply and production lines. So those are kind of things for which demining and those kind of things, that there were working groups that had come in place. So if you ask me typically what really India can do to make a difference, I think India can steer this kind of a piece, which is more in terms of a process than in terms of a grand decision right now, because the grand decision cannot really happen. And if these two parties are willing to talk, then I'm sure there would be so many countries who are willing to offer them a room and a cup of tea. But I think that's besides the point. I think you have to look at it like that. Whenever there is peace in Ukraine, it is going to be a collaborative effort, and that collaborative effort cannot be done in one day. So it is going to be a slow and steady process. And I think in my opinion, the way I interpret Prime Minister's statements, as well as Mr. Quatra's statement out there, is that India is willing to do all that it takes in its power. And by that, I think it is all
stakeholders
about
on board also,
its effort for the collaborative efforts. Yes.
All stakeholders have to be on board, is what the Foreign Secretary said. But, let's move on to a story, and then we'll come back to our guests. India and Austria are celebrating a significant milestone in their diplomatic relations. India and Austria are marking 75 years since the establishment of their bilateral ties. DD India's Mihir Makuri gives us a comprehensive overview of India and Austria's multifaceted relations in this report. The world's fastest growing economy, India, and a key Central European player, Austria, are commemorating 75 years of bilateral diplomatic ties. Diplomatic relations between India and Austria were established in 1949, heralding a robust and amicable partnership founded on shared values of democracy and pluralism. India intervened in favor of Austria during its negotiations with the Soviet Union on the State Treaty of Austria that resulted in the independence of Austria in 1955. Against this backdrop, Prime Minister Narendra Modi's visit to Austria holds special significance, making him the first Indian Prime Minister to visit the country in over 40 years. India sees Austria as a strategic partner, presenting significant opportunities for cooperation in sectors such as infrastructure, renewable energy, high technology, and startups. Now let's take a look at bilateral ties between India and Austria. 75 years of India-Austria ties. India-Austria trade is well balanced at around $3 billion each year. Indian exports to Austria stands at 1.52 billion USD. Imports from Austria stand at 1.41 billion USD. Indian investments in Austria amount to over 1 billion USD. Austrian investments in India are at over 800 million USD. Austria offers opportunities for collaboration in multiple fields ranging from infra to startups. India-Austria Startup Bridge was launched in February 2024. 20-plus Indian startups went to Austria in June this year to participate in a startup event. India-Austria also inked a landmark comprehensive migration and mobility agreement in May 2024. Indo-Austrian cultural relations have roots dating back to the 16th century. Teaching of Sanskrit at Vienna University started in 1845. The Indian Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore visited Vienna in 1921 and again in 1926. Even Indian artists, including Ustad Amjad Ali Khan, Zakir Hussain, and Pandit Hariprasad Chaurasia, have performed shows in Austria. Today, Austria is home to over 31,000 Indians, fostering robust people-to-people connections between the two countries. With Prime Minister Modi's historic visit, the Indo-Austrian relationship
is set to make substantial strides across all sectors of mutual interest. Mihir Makori's report, DD India.
So let's turn to our guests once again. Ambassador Deepak Bora, well, that report tells us about, the roadmap and how things are going. But if we come back to some of the issues that were discussed today, one of the issues was fighting terrorism and the nature of the challenge, especially in cyber, in the cyberspace and the concerns there. How do you view this? And the Prime Minister had suggested that this has to be done in real time and with immediate exchange of information.
Thank you very much. Once again, delighted to be here, continuing with you. First question we have to ask ourselves, why has it taken the Indian Prime Minister 41 years to visit Austria?
Okay.
Let me put this across to you from a diplomatic perspective. Listen, Austrians, we love you. We know you love us. You are busy with your stuff. We are busy with our stuff. So, jab time milega, whenever we have the time, we'll exchange a visit. That says it all. Austria has never damaged us. We have never damaged Austria. But we've been busy in our own affairs. And as far as terrorism is concerned, till about 4 years ago, Vienna was spared the kind of terrorist violence we've seen in London, we've seen it in Paris, we've seen Berlin, we've seen it in Madrid. But I think 3 or 4 years ago, there was a shooting incident where a chap shot up several people, injured several others, some Islamized radical, and then the police shot him. And then there have been a couple of other incidents. So suddenly the Austrians have woken up to the menace of terrorism. And therefore, they agreed entirely with India's position. There are no good terrorists, there are no bad terrorists. We have to come together and fight terrorism in all its dimensions, whether it's physical terrorism, a fellow running around with a weapon on the streets or in a department store or wherever, or cyber terrorism, where people are indulging in stuff that they shouldn't be doing. So this was the focus. And I believe, sir, in this domain, the Austrians have a lot to learn from India, because our digital public infrastructure, our IT prowess, etc., they will learn how we are tackling it. So they were as keen as we were to sign an agreement or to agree on including terrorism in the joint statement.
Right. Dr. Rao, what are your views on this in terms of, the issue of radicalization and how it's taking place and how it's a challenge to stop, especially in the cyber age?
Right. So I'd just like to add a few points when Ambassador Bora was just telling about why it take 40 years for India. I think a very good parallel that comes to my mind is the case of example of Greece that, when I also wrote about it, that like in 40 years, perhaps it was 40 years later that an Indian Prime Minister actually thought of going to Greece, while Greece was always this low-hanging fruit for India's strategic partnership, because like you said, you have never really had anything against each other, and all your other strategic and other parameters in terms of other ideas, all the cultural similarities, there's just so much to actually build on. So a similar case you can see with the case of Austria. Of course, Austria and Greece have some differences as well, but then I just wanted to sort of set that on record that it was only when Prime Minister went to Greece and so many developments started happening that everybody started looking at Greece afresh. And all this while it was lying as a low-hanging fruit and nobody really paid attention because everything was going fine. So I think it's the same situation in the case of Austria. When you come to, counter-terrorism, see, I think if counter-terrorism has been a part of India's diplomatic maneuvers and diplomatic outreaches almost with most of its strategic partners. In fact, if you allow me, Mark, I'd like to, connect it to perhaps a more well-known platform, which is SCO, the summit where Prime Minister chose not to go this time. Now, one of the reasons why SCO, when it comes to counterterrorism particularly, of course, SCO is important to us because of our outreach to Central Asia and out of, because Iran is a member and there's Chabahar. Of course, I'm not getting into that. But one of the real things that SCO really stands for is the regional security and all that. And that structure that they have, which is called RATS, right, which is anti-terrorism, the regional architecture for anti-terrorism.
Right.
And in that particular structure, it loses relevance for India, even though India is so committed to terrorism, is because Pakistan is also part of SCO. Yes. And Pakistan is where all the terrorism in India is coming from. And, you've heard of all these, the recent terror attacks in Kathua and all of that. So it's very painful. So what I'm saying is that And because of that, India, SCO has little to offer to India, especially when it comes to fighting terrorism. But if you look at India's joint statements with most of its strategic partners, beginning from, look at anybody, the French or, Americans, whoever it is, you will always see that India has always had this vertical of counterterrorism. And I think India, and by the way, let me also tell you that, close to Austria is France, and the French government actually runs a program where they sent their representatives from the police, from the internal security officers and the external security officers. They combine them, they pick them up, and then they sent them all over the world to learn from their terrorist operations. And in 2023, 2024, they actually chose India, and they've been doing these, these sessions with India.
Right.
So I completely agree with Ambassador Vohra that India has a lot to offer when it comes to tackling, counterterrorism, because despite all of that, you see, on the one hand, you have an America that can do a 9/11, to fight terrorism. On the other hand, you have an example of Russia doing what it did in Grozny, if you remember, to fight terrorism. And if you look at India with all these problems, but at the same time, we have always tried to tackle the approach which will cause least amount of damage and most amount of, change. So I think there's enough that India can really offer to the world in a more constructive manner. And I hope that this particular cooperation will grow forward by leaps and bounds.
Ambassador Vohra, when we look at what India brings to the table, we see that India is innovative. We have this startup culture. We have a lot of talent, while Austria apparently has science and technology and engineering and these skills as well. So the talent comes from India, and well, they can also, there is plenty that the two can see in terms of cooperation in this area, and in the future in terms of a new ecosystem for, let's say, high tech. Where do you see us going in this area? We've signed a mobility and migration agreement.
You're absolutely right. It's a very perceptive question. At the moment, the Indian diaspora of 31, 32, 33,000 is mainly people working in what we euphemistically say the health sector, but it's a number of nurses from Kerala who are working there. I've been there, I've seen them all. And then we have some people working in IT and so on. By the way, Y2K, the year 2000 was when our IT prowess was catapulted into the global consciousness, also in Austria. We used to be asked that, can you send a few chaps, we have this problem, we have that problem, can they sort it out for us? So that certainly has helped. But the new areas which Austria is worried about, apart from terrorism, is also climate change. We're also concerned about that. And that's one area where we can cooperate. You talked about Austrian technology. Let me tell you, I've seen this myself. The two big tunnels that we started with, one is the Rohtang Pass, now called the Atal Tunnel, and the one that we are building under Zojila Pass. These are built with something called NATM, New Austrian Tunneling Methods, which is the best in the world. Now, all our tunnels, all across India, are using this technology, because I can't give you the technical details, but it's better than the conventional methods. So we are using this. Then the Austrians, they have 150 companies that are operating in India. We have some Indian companies that are operating there. But the real meat in the relationship will come in new critical emerging technologies, where Austria has done some work, where we have done some work. This will be a partnership of equals. There won't be a one-way transfer of technology, it'll be two ways. Austria needs from us certain areas where we are the best in the world, and there are certain sectors where we would like to learn from Austria's experience.
And Dr. Rao, the approach that the two principals followed this time round was to talk to the CEOs of companies and listen to them and take forward their ideas, which, if we refer back to the Foreign Secretary, it's actually the initiatives of the CEOs that now is going to get the support of government. So it is a bottom-up kind of approach in terms of this kind of relationship. How do you view this?
Yeah, a couple of things there, Mark, which are important to be highlighted. One is that please remember that we are in the process of negotiating a very ambitious free trade agreement with the EU, right? And Austria, by the way, is an EU member, but is not a NATO member. So one must have the distinction about Austria. Anyway, coming back, so we are negotiating that, and it is having its own issues and its problems. And in the interregnum, we are also reaching out, and we are also doubling down in many ways, you can say, the efforts to actually basically build these new age economic ties and investment ties with so many European countries. And the latest to join that bandwagon somewhere is the EFTA, the non-EU countries, which were, with whom we recently signed a very ambitious free trade agreement for the first time, which that promises $100 billion worth of investment in India over the next 15 years. So I think from looking at it from India's perspective, I think there's more confidence in India that yes, you can really sort of build these bridges, with the developed world on the one hand, and I think India has also taken a very, I would say, a granular, so to say, approach to it, that you directly go and talk to the CEOs and try to sort of build it up, okay, bottom up, as you said, and also looking at the trade, which is about $3.9 billion annual trade. The good thing about the trade is that it's very equal. So, you would see that there's a good balance in terms of exports and imports. Yes. And this is exactly what we want, because let's not forget that the two main priorities for Modi 3.0 are economic progress and national security. So, of course, with national security is not really a vertical that we're discussing with Austria. Obviously, it's basically economic progress. But in economic progress, I think we are also looking at deliverables. So we are really trying to get into not these long behemoth kind of agreements which take forever, but, trying to do changes that can really yield results quickly. And the bottom-up approach is a good approach, number one. The other thing that I would like to mention here is that, by the way, Austria within the European Union itself has been a very, very credible renewable energy actor. You'd be, surprised to know that it was towards the end of 2016 itself that Austria already fulfilled the EU Renewables Directive goal for the year 2020. So they were way ahead than a lot of other, EU members. And also, I think green energy and, the renewable energy sector is obviously one sector where we can really sort of have very good exchange and very good joint ventures, because Austria's energy policy rests on three pillars, okay, on security of supply, energy efficiency, and renewables, okay? And if you look carefully, if you were to unpack security of supply, energy efficiency, and renewables, you would see that there's a lot that, they could do in terms of a, joint venture, in terms of investments with India. And that is why you see all those things finding their way in the joint statement as well. And I'm not surprised to see the startup, because I think May 20 last year or somewhere we also have something called a startup bridge already.
Yeah, that happened in February of this year.
Yes. So I think you found all those things in the joint statement. They were not really a surprise. And what I am looking forward to in terms of this strategic partnership with Austria is not some very lofty goal, but I think something which is more bottom up, which which can deliver results quickly. Because like I said, that's one of the priorities of the Modi government. And then, and it's pretty much, I would say, evident and self-explanatory as to what approach we are taking.
Right. Ambassador Vora, we are waiting for Prime Minister's address to the Indian community. So let's talk a little bit about public diplomacy and the role that, Prime Minister speaking to the Indian community in different parts of the world. What is, what is really achieved? And what is the diaspora's role in cultural and public diplomacy?
That's again a brilliant question. Let me answer this. I've been in diplomacy 51 years and counting. I'm 73 years young. I've seen many prime ministers, presidents from India, visited the United States, visited other countries, there was France, Spain, etc., where I've served, and they do interact with the Indian diaspora. But this prime minister, the present prime minister, has made it an integral part of his program. Wherever he goes, whatever the size of the Indian diaspora, the Indian community, he makes it a point to talk to them and to tell them about what is happening in the country. Because, sir, all said and done, Doordarshan is the best channel in the world. You are our national channel, and I was born here. What happens is that the world depends on Western media, and they are not going to tell you the truth about India. So when the Prime Minister goes there, I've heard some of the questions that were put to him. Sir, is it true that this is happening? Is it true that this is burning, that is burning, this has gone wrong? And then he gives a clear answer that the reality is this. Therefore, I think that his outreach in terms of public diplomacy is absolutely brilliant. He's a born communicator. He knows how to touch people's hearts. So he tells them, this is what's happening in India, this is what's happening in India, fourth largest economy, third most powerful military, etc., largest population. And he's telling them that our time has come. India is making its place in the world. May I just end this by saying, sir, I was at the Munich Security Dialogue listening to somebody speak, and an Arab minister was saying that as far as security in our region is concerned, the Americans got thrashed in Afghanistan, have run away. We don't trust the British and the French. They are hiding somewhere. The Chinese nobody likes. The Russians are busy with Ukraine. And then he made a comment that leaves one net security provider in our region, that is Bharat. I must tell you, from 6'2", I stood 6 feet 8 inches tall when I heard him say that.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing that Prime Minister is so good at, telling the Indian diaspora that you are bridges between the country where you have chosen to live and your motherland, and keep strengthening that bridge and building new areas of cooperation. They have an important role to play.
Dr. Rao, your views on this, also on the cultural aspect. After all, Vienna, has a lot of culture, much like India, and a lot of Indians have been involved with, the Western classical culture as well. In fact, when Prime Minister was greeted, there was a philharmonic, the University Philharmonic, which was conducted by an Indian. And we've known that Zubin Mehta also had conducted the Vienna Philharmonic during his time as well.
Oh yes. I mean, what's there to add? I think that was a grand start, because I think as an Indian, there wouldn't be there would be no Indian, I think, in my understanding, who would not get a lump in their throat hearing the soulful melody of Vande Mataram, and especially so when you are abroad. And I think it makes even more special. It's made even more special when you see that it's been put together by people that are not Indians, but led by an Indian. I think the gentleman from Lucknow. So obviously, I think that was a very beautiful and a very aesthetic start. I think it was a very fitting start, very dignified one at that. And Prime Minister himself has been putting it on X and posting about it as to how much he liked it. So that's one part. What more can I add apart from the fact that I loved it? And with respect to people-to-people ties, yes, I completely agree. I think Ambassador Bora has put it so wonderfully that there's very little for me to add. But yes, I would like to share that wherever I travel in the world, I always see people coming up and, for example, congratulating me as an Indian about, oh, what a wonderful job you did with G20, or what a wonderful Prime Minister you have. So obviously the Prime Minister has that aura. And there is this X factor in the Prime Minister that makes him very, very special as a communicator. And he is a born communicator. He has the blessings of Saraswati. There's no doubt about that. And everywhere you travel, I mean, you see it on the faces of leaders he meets, and whether it's a melody, or whether it's the Biden, or whether it's a Trump, or whether it's a President Putin, or whoever it is. So you see that, and there's very, very little I can add there. This one thing that I probably wanted to mention the last time when we were discussing all the AI and the green energy, etc. I think there's one more thing which has come up in the joint the joint statement, which is about what is their plan to further multilateralism. And I know multilateralism is having a lot of problem in the world, but I was really struck, and I would like to mention that I think Prime Minister Modi has invited Austria to join the International Solar Alliance and also the Biofuel Alliance. So I think these are kind of things that we need to, that sort of, bring in sharper focus on what really we are intending to do. There was also this mention of IMEC, which of course right now seems to be in doldrums because of the situation in West Asia. But by and large, if you ask me, I think it's a very well-rounded, meeting, and especially considering that it's the first one in the last 40 years by an Indian Prime Minister. The kind of welcome he received, the kind of, it was, I think, in terms of value addition, there was a lot of value addition that could be done after 40 years by itself. And yes, I'm sure the Indians out there are very, very proud to see the Prime Minister.
Sure. So let's take up that point that Dr. Rao raised, Ambassador Bora, about multilateralism. And, Austria has been invited to join the International Solar Alliance, the Disaster-Resistant Infrastructure Coalition, and also the Global Biofuels Alliance. And we both supported each other's positions for the UNSC, but it's not it's the non-permanent type of UNSC. Yeah. But we're looking for much more, right, in terms of reforms of the international organizations. How best is this case being put forward?
It'll have to be done at the ground level. Mr. Lin, I've seen this for many years. I've been in this business long enough. The prime ministers meet, the leaders meet, certain agreements are reached, but ultimately the follow-up is done by the ambassadors and their staff members and their colleagues in the mission in New Delhi and wherever the prime minister has gone to visit. So if that follow-up is not effective, then really the visit itself loses its momentum over a period of time. Now, for example, we are sitting in your channel, we're talking about Russia and Austria, then the prime minister goes off somewhere else, the focus will be there, and this will recede because it stays in public memory for a few months unless there is very effective follow-up. So multilateral approach, this is something that India believes in very, very strongly. We used to have, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, everybody knows about this, a so-called unipolar world. And today, people talk of multipolar. I prefer to say that we have a non-polar world. We believe that a world should exist in which everybody has the right to speak. G20 was referred to. Yes, sir. You might recall that in January, before the G20 summit took place in the nation's capital, the Prime Minister convened a virtual meeting of 125 developing countries and their leaders and saying, Tigers, what is your challenge? And they all told us, we want this, because nobody listens to us in that grandmother's great-grandmother called the United Nations in New York. They will say, just shut up and sit down. We are not going to listen to you in a tiny little country somewhere. So we raised those issues. We put them in the New Delhi document. And don't forget, sir, the European Union became a member of G20 long before we brought the African Union in, for which I personally am very proud, having served in Africa. So on the multilateral front, we've done very well. We want to involve as many people as possible in taking decisions. Let me conclude by saying our partnership with Austria, it's a term that I use, is a soft partnership. There are no areas where we disagree. We're not fighting with each other. We're not abusing each other. With the United States, with Russia, it's a hard partnership where there are certain security issues involved which are very important for us. That is the difference. That doesn't mean to say one is more important than the other. As many friends as we can make, the better it is for our world.